Hi, I'm Jenny Ray, the Managing Director of Management Consulted, and we're back today to bring you another installment of our case interview series. Today, we're talking about an often asked question. What is the difference between interviewer-led cases and interviewee-led cases? And if you aren't exposed to consulting or haven't been for very long, you might even not know what I'm talking about. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just explain what I mean by the two of those. Then I'm going to talk about firms that use, in general, each of the specific types. I'm going to talk about what's the same about each of them, what's different, and also how across multiple rounds you may find, even within the same firm, different variations of these types of methodologies. Interviewee-led cases are generally implying that you, as the interviewee, are developing the structure and then leading the interviewer through your structure. Interviewer-led cases are generally implying that the interviewer has a specific subset of questions that they want you to answer. So even if you start with an initial structure, they may ask you to completely discard it as they walk through their pre-decided questions as they're working through the case. Each of these, like I said, have some similarities, they also have some differences, and they will work in different situations in each of the cases. So I thought it would be helpful just to break them down for you so that you can understand where you're more likely to see each of the types of cases as you go through the process. The first thing that's important to understand is what's similar about these two types of cases. And there are a couple of things that are similar. The first thing that's similar are the openings. So case interviews that both are interviewee-led and interviewer-led are opened in exactly the same way. They give you the background and you're responsible for doing the recap, walking through each of the clarifying questions, making sure that you work through each of the pieces as you prepare to present your game plan and give them a game plan. Regardless of the type of case and who's leading, you will be leading that part at the beginning. So make sure that you're prepared to open the case in a really strong way. Nobody's going to tell you what they're looking for from you at that part of the case. So you're responsible no matter what for leading that. The second piece is as you're walking through the case, when you walk through the anatomy of the case, you're going to discover that all cases, whether you lead them or whether they lead them, if they're done effectively, have the same anatomy. So you open up with the same 5 pieces all the way through the game plan. Then afterward, you're going to go backward and forward between quantitative questions and creative questions. As you go back and forth between the two of these, whether you're leading or they're leading, you're going to be solving the case using numbers and interpretation, using interpretation and backing it up with numbers. And the final piece of the case closing, comes no matter what type of leadership is happening. So really, the anatomy that you move through in the case, from the opening to the middle part to all the way at the end, is exactly the same, regardless of whether the interview is leading or the interviewer is leading. Then, in addition, it's really important to understand that the traits that they're looking for are actually completely the same in both of these situations. They're looking for structure, they're looking for problem solving, they're looking for clear communication. And your ability to demonstrate those will often be very similar across multiple firms, which is why, especially in recent years, we're finding a lot of people are getting cross offers at BCG and at McKinsey, where in the past they were really different and the skill sets that the firms were looking for actually felt different inside the interview. Today, people are beginning to realize that they're looking for the same things. So make sure that you understand that there are a lot of similarities between these two types of cases. But probably more important to understand is what's different about them. Of course, that's why you want to know about them, so you can prepare mentally for how you should walk into a case. Well, there are a couple of key differences, and it's really helpful to understand what they are. For interviewee-led cases, you are responsible for using your structure to lead and solve the case. BCG is the most famous firm that uses this type of planning. And what they're looking for is not only your ability to work through a case if they spoon feed you, but they're looking for your ability to direct the case like a consultant actually would. You have to have a higher level of mastery of the concepts. You have to have a clearer sense of confidence as you're working through the process. You have to have a better handle on how to effectively ask not just questions, but the right questions when you're going through the process. So BCG is the type of firm that tests this type of process. And basically what it looks like is that as the interviewer, they sit back and they say, great, what do you want to do next? Oh, that's interesting. Well, I have some data on that. But they're very passive. They really rely on you as the interviewee to direct them through the case and draw out from them what you need in terms of data. On the other hand, interviewer-led cases, McKinsey cases, are not just there to make life easier for you, although that would be nice. Rather, they're there to dive incredibly deep into specific areas that you would likely not be able to cover if you were leading the case yourself. You wouldn't know, for example, that this particular chart is something that you would have had to put together because it would be 3 levels down in terms of the analysis that you would be doing in the actual case. So McKinsey uses the interviewer-led model to drive into deep areas that you might have touched on briefly in your overall structure, but wouldn't have known exactly what direction to go. They also use it to present more complicated and often more difficult data to calculate when they're actually inside the case. So McKinsey cases will feel more like you are proposing what to do, and then they tell you what they'd like to do instead. It's not that you're wrong, it's just that they have a pre-prescribed notion of exactly how they want to move through the case to get you to the answer. It is still important, however, for McKinsey cases for you to direct them in terms of what you think should happen next. If you're really getting effective at cases, you'll find that what you want to do next is exactly the same as what they want to do next, even though theirs might just go one level deeper. Now, I said at the beginning of the interview video that for this particular situation, you might not just find differences between firms. For example, at BCG, you might find a case that feels a little bit more interviewer-led. And at McKinsey, you might come across a case that feels a little bit more interviewee-led. Don't be surprised by this. Let me break down when most likely this happens. There are generally 3 rounds for all interviews. In fact, most interviews, to be fair, have just 2 rounds that are guaranteed. But a 3rd round, which I call round 0, is common for experienced professional candidates. Let me walk through each one of these rounds and talk about what you can expect from interviewee-led versus interviewer-led processes in each one. The first case is a round 0 case, and round 0 cases are 10 to 20 minutes. They're often by phone, and they're used for screening. This is if you're applying outside of your core region. So let's say you're currently living in the United States but want to work in the Middle East. Oftentimes they'll do a screening round interview. These can also be HR interviews. So there's somebody at HR who's just testing to see generally how you think through problems. These types of cases can be open-ended scenario cases, where I just say, what would you do in this situation? Market sizing cases, which ask one simple problem, or just general high-level cases. These screening rounds are by phone or in person, often no, they're by phone. And you can expect either type of interview in these, interviewer-led or interviewee-led. But most often, even if they're interviewer-led, they're much more simple than a standard McKinsey case would be. You just don't have as much time to cover the same amount of ground, and they're really just looking for an initial read on how you're doing. The second round, which I call round 1 because it's the most common round where people start, especially when they're going through the on-campus interview process, is 20 to 30 minutes for the entire interview. It's almost always conducted in person unless you're really far out of the region and not able to travel. Usually you're given straightforward cases, and they're more than likely interviewer-led. Let me tell you why. Usually when you're in these types of rounds across large groups of people, there are 60 or more people that are interviewing in the same round. In order to create consistency across the round, either a lot of people are given the same types of cases, or the cases are pre-selected to be of an appropriate equal level of difficulty so that everyone is getting approximately the same test when they're going through the case interview process. So even if you're working with Bain or sometimes even BCG, you might find that in the first round, you're getting cases that are similar to your peers. They've been pre-selected, and they're more often interviewer-led. This round is the weed out round. They're trying to just determine who can do cases from who can't. They're not trying to determine who can do cases the best. They're just trying to determine who can do them and who can't do them. So make sure that you're adept for round 0 and round 1 at practicing both type of cases, but you definitely understand how to defer to the leader in an interviewer type case. The final case type in round 2 is often much longer. 30 to 40 minutes is the actual case portion that you cover there. And in these types of interviews, you're going to do a deep dive into specific areas. What I mean by that is that the interviewer is often a more senior person, and they're not that interested in covering all of the bases. They know at this point that you can do cases. They want to understand how deep does your understanding go. So in this case, it's really particular that to often find interviewee-led cases. They're going to try to figure out where you are interested in going next and they're going to probe you on those particular areas. They're not as interested in covering all the bases. They're just interested in getting a good read on you. So partners, because they're less adherent to the rules and less likely to actually have to report to anybody outside of the other person that you're interviewing with in order to make a decision on you, are more likely to give you interviewee-led cases in second rounds. The round 2 case is the road to the offer. So you have to be flexible and prepared to switch gears a little bit. You don't want to just wait for them to lead you, but you also don't want to push too hard if they want to have more of a conversation with you. So just be prepared to vary your approach and adjust it as needed. Make sure that you're prepared for both types of processes, interviewee-led and interviewer-led. Regardless of which firms you're practicing for, make sure that you practice both. And in particular, if you're not sure where to start, I always recommend starting with interviewee-led cases. They help train you to identify good structures that will really help you solve the problem and to identify at each step along the way what needs to come next to most effectively get to the answer. If you've got questions about these differences in the types of cases, feel free to get a copy of our Consulting Interview Bible or work with us one-on-one. We'd love to help test you on either an interviewee-led case, an interviewer-led case, or even both. And if you have more questions, make sure to visit us on our website at managementconsulted.com.